Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the new Canon EOS RP full-frame mirrorless camera from Canon. This is a 26 megapixel full-frame mirrorless camera, which is the second in the lineup of the R series from Canon. Now, if you missed my first look / overview video, I did delineate, kind of took you on a tour of the camera, the body, what's there, and also some areas of distinction from the EOS R if you're trying to differentiate these two models to see, which might work for you. And so I would recommend that you take a look at that video if you want to get kind of a fuller picture, and I'll just hit a few of the highlights here. I did note in that video that while the RP has a much more traditional setup in terms of the configuration, those of you that are coming from, say, a Canon Rebel series DSLR, you will find that it feels very familiar in your hand in a lot of ways. But I don't actually see that as being a detriment. In fact, some of the ways where I was most critical of the EOS R were the areas where camera deviated from its typical blueprint when it comes to camera ergonomics. And while I lauded the EOS R for having a fantastic grip, which by the way, the RP, although it is considerably smaller, it retains just a fantastic grip that I haven't really used anything from Sony or Fuji that matches this in the mirrorless space. And so they've done a really good job with the grip. But with EOS R, they tried a few different new things. They had a multi-purpose dial at the top that served as both mode dial and a secondary control dial, along with a top-mounted LCD screen. They implemented a touch bar on the back, and I largely panned both of those things. I didn't find that they really added anything that I considered to be a major improvement, and it just kind of added layers of complexity without a whole lot of functionality. Now, I recognize that not everyone shared that opinion, and some people actually liked the touch bar, although a lot of you did agree with me when it comes to that. But in this case, going to kind of more traditional controls, to me, has produced a more cohesive camera in the RP than what I found in the EOS R. And so I actually prefer the physical controls here for the most part compared to the EOS R, though there are a few limitations that are there. And so let me just, after using the camera even longer, I'll dig into that a little bit more. For one thing, when it comes to using manual focus lenses, and of course mirrorless platforms are a great place for using manual focus lenses for a variety of reasons. You have the opportunity to employ manual focus aids like focus peaking. You have the ability to magnify the image in the viewfinder and thus be able to visually confirm focus much more easily. The EOS R, however, actually had a focus guide that was a really clever implementation that actually worked really well for manual focus, to where as you came into correct focus that these lines would begin to come together and line up to let you know when you had really nailed focus. And it was actually a surprisingly effective system. Unfortunately, not one that is shared here with the RP. And in the RP, you're kind of left with the kind of traditional either focus overlays, focus peaking, or mapping out a magnification of how to magnify and then manually focus. And so that's one ergonomic place where I think that there is a step back. However, what you do have here is an excellent touchscreen, and of course that's shared with the EOS R, but Canon's articulating touchscreens are really the best in the business. Their touchscreens are far more responsive. They work really well, and that is, of course, a big plus if you're considering the RP compared to perhaps some other camera system model, is that is a genuinely useful feature that I think surpasses in functionality either the tilting type screens that some others employ. And the touchscreen continues to be really fantastic here. Also, they implemented in this, although they have added it to the EOS R via firmware update, the ability to use what they call pupil AF, what Sony calls IAF, but to use it during continuous focus mode, which of course makes it infinitely more useful than only being able to use it in a single shot or still mode when, if you're shooting something with eyes, it means, as I said in the EOS R review, things with eyes move. And so to not have a full-time autofocus while you're doing IAF, pupil AF is kind of pointless. Fortunately, they've added that functionality to now both of these cameras, and I'm sure that will be status quo moving ahead with the EOS R system. Now, another area where you do take a bit of a step back is that in both the viewfinder itself and the LCD screen, there is a reduction in resolution, and so it's not quite as good as what you get on the EOS R. You've got a ever so slightly smaller screen, but it's also lower resolution, and the same is true of the viewfinder. And so the viewfinder is noticeably not as good. It's still pretty good. I mean, colors are good in it. It handles a lot of things well, but obviously it lacks the resolution and also the size of that of the EOS R. And that the EOS R's viewfinder was probably the best electronic viewfinder that I'd seen thus far, and so certainly the RP is a little bit of a step back when it comes to that. Now, in a secondary episode, we took a look at the actual sensor performance. Now, the EOS R inherits a very similar sensor to that of the Canon 5D Mark IV, which fortunately for the EOS R is perhaps Canon's best sensor. The RP inherits a 26 megapixel sensor that is taken from the Canon 6D Mark II. And unfortunately, it's not nearly as robust a sensor when it is pressed. And so in that secondary episode, that if you want to look at that in detail, I recommend that you take a look at that. I compared it to the 5D Mark IV, which is similar to comparing it to the EOS R. I just don't have the EOS R on hand. But what I found in doing that segment is that while on the upper end in highlights, the sensors perform roughly the same, when it comes to pulling shadows, there is a noticeable difference between the EOS R and the EOS RP. The RP, unfortunately, if you have to push the shadows really any kind of amount outside of a stop and maybe two, you start to introduce some notable discoloration both in color noise, and then as you press a little bit further into color banding, that really is a limitation of a lack of dynamic range as compared to the 5D Mark IV. Now, when it comes to shooting, basic images, where you're not having to push things too much, the RP does just fine. It takes beautiful photos, with that, well-regarded Canon color science. And, and so photos look really great, nice detail, all of that. However, in those circumstances where you're needing a little bit more, perhaps you're in a really high contrast situation or in a low light situation, unfortunately, the RP's sensor, or that of the 6D Mark II, is really not competitive with what's coming out from a lot of competing camera systems at this point. And so I do take that as a liability. Another area that is a liability is when it comes to the performance of the video. Now, before I say that, let me say that by and large, there are, on a practical level, there are a few less autofocus points when compared to that of the EOS R, which the EOS R had a really, really incredible amount of autofocus points, over 5,000 of them. And this has less points, but we're still talking over 4,000 of them. It's a massive amount of autofocus points, and it has the exact same coverage in terms of the coverage of the actual sensor area. So, I mean, this is if you're considering the RP versus the 6D Mark II, I would say probably the biggest single area where the RP sets itself apart is the autofocus is much, much better. It's far more robust. You can have coverage over much more of the area, and so it really is a really great autofocus system there. However, when it comes to the video application, while this camera does employ Canon's DP-AF up till full HD, if you switch over to 4K, which already you're limited in 4K to a pretty huge crop factor, over 1.7 times, and you're also limited to a maximum frame rate of 24 frames per second, which is fine for a cinematic look, but certainly I would prefer to have options of, at least doing 30 frames per second. But you're also limited when you go to 4K by the reality that you no longer have DP-AF. And does that make a difference? It certainly does. Take a look at these video clips, just doing focus pulls to and from. That was using the Canon 35mm f1.8 RF lens, so a native lens. And what you saw in that is that the focus pulls were both faster and more confident in full HD, which is DPAF, or dual pixel AF, compared to the 4K, where it's not employing DPAF, where I saw not only were they a lot slower in making focus changes, but I also saw a little bit of pulsing there at the end before it settled on its final focus value. And so that is a pretty severe limitation when it comes to shooting video. And so while it is better than the 60 Mark II in that you at least have a 4K option, that 4K option is limited both in its frame rate and then also the autofocus system you have at your disposal to do 4K video. So maybe something to bear in mind if you're cross-shopping this. At the end of the day, however, I find it somewhat easier to be forgiving of the EOS RP than what I do of the EOS R. In my EOS R review, I treated it as being a competent yet flawed camera. There were a number of areas where it's not up to par when compared to competitors from either Nikon or Sony in the mirrorless space, or even the Fuji X space when you're talking about that. There are other areas ergonomically, it's superior. The articulating screen, it's better. It had a few unique features, and of course the RF lenses continue to be, everything that we've seen thus far, continue to be really, really awesome lenses, howbeit somewhat pricey. But I docked to the EOS R because its price point at the time of around $2,200 made it like a direct competitor to the Sony a7 III, for example. And the Sony a7 III is just a more complete camera. It had a faster burst rate. It had a equally good autofocus system. It had much more options when it comes to video control. And so, it had dual slots, a lot of, kind of pro features. And so, it made the EOS R a little bit more of a hard sell if you're looking at it from outside the Canon ecosystem. If you're in the Canon ecosystem, these are great cameras for the simple reason that while you have to use an adapter to use your EF lenses, they perform not just like native. In some cases, they actually perform better because you get more robust autofocus performance. And so if you're wanting to continue to retain your Canon glass, it's very tempting to go to these bodies. In this case, yes, the RP has more limitations as compared to the EOS R. EOS R has a better sensor. It has some features that are lacking here, including those, kind of niggly things that Canon does. Like in this case, you've got a shutter speed limit of 1/4000th of a second versus 1/8000th of a second, that kind of stuff. But at the same time, the very low price point of this, the price point of this in the US market at $1,299, and sometimes, already even a little bit less than that. Often you get an adapter thrown in depending on where you buy a kit from. Getting all of that for that price point makes it really, at least in my knowledge, the lowest price of entry into a new, not, 5 or 6 year old tech that's marked way down, but in terms of a true modern full frame camera, I don't think that you're getting in at a lower price point than that. And so thus I think it makes it a really competitive camera for those that are interested in the benefits of a mirrorless system or a very user-friendly camera, which this certainly is. With a great autofocus system, produces very nice results. I see this as being a great camera for families, for example. And its low price point means that people can actually afford to take a chance on it. And at that price point, I'm a little bit more forgiving of its flaws. And so at the end of the day, I think this camera is not necessarily for a serious photographer that is going to be shooting in situations where they need good dynamic range. Certainly not for someone whose priority is shooting video, particularly if you're interested in the 4K video space. But if you are a stills photographer that wants a camera that feels great in the hand, is very user-friendly and easy to use, and produces nice results, I think the EOS RP is a very deserving consideration, particularly if that's where your budget goes to. I certainly would choose it over the Canon 60 Mark II myself. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery. You can see photos that I've taken, both with the 35mm f1.8 macro lens that I'm simultaneously reviewing, along with a number of my other Canon EF mount lenses via adapter. So take a look at that, and you can see a lot of photos there. Beyond that, there's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. There are the traditional links there where you can follow me on social media platforms, including now on Instagram. There's also links there to become a patron to help to support this channel, and also to get sneak previews of upcoming content, which I do every week for the patrons. And finally, beyond that, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.